Welcome to the New Age Masonic Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the New Age magazine, predecessor to the Scottish Rite Journal. On this podcast, we take a deep dive into the articles of the history, people, and lessons of Freemasonry, as written in the New Age magazine, and their pertinence to both everyday personal and Masonic life. Hosted by brothers Maynard Edwards, 32nd degree KCCH, Matt Bowers, 18th degree, and Chris Ruli, 32nd degree KCCH. Articles from the New Age magazine read by Matt Bowers and brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the world.
Welcome to the New Age Masonic Podcast, brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction for the United States of America. I am Maynard Edwards, 32nd degree KCCH.
I am Chris Ruli, 32nd degree KCCH.
And I am Matt Bowers, 18th degree.
Welcome and thank you for tuning in to this brand new production from the Supreme Council, and thanks to the Supreme Council and Grand Commander Jim Cole for allowing us the opportunity to do this. The New Age magazine was the predecessor of the Scottish Rite Journal, published, Chris, roughly from 1904 and into the 80s?
June, July 1904, all the way into the 80s.
And Chris is the guy who digitized all of these, and they're slowly being made available for research, for, you know, just to review some of the stuff that's in there, because it's just a wealth of Masonic study.
Yeah, it's a treasure trove. It genuinely is.
So let's talk a little bit about the New Age itself. And again, if you've seen older copies of this, it's like about the size of the old National Geographic magazine in terms of the shape of it.
It's sort of shifted, though, because the early editions were, yes, in that National Geographic style, yellow sort of cover. There's usually a picture or something on the front. And then around, I want to say the 60s, 70s, maybe the 50s, actually, it transferred over to that Reader's Digest version, which was pocket-sized, smaller. There was a picture on it. The articles were condensed, right? It was like maybe 2 or 3 pages.
And it was roughly
article.
the size, it was glossy, too, at that point.
Slightly,
and it was roughly the size of the current Knight Templar magazine, that if you're a York Rite Mason who's in the Templars, and you received that magazine, it was roughly that size. Like you said, the Reader's Digest
pocket size, you know?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And we don't really know what the thinking was behind that, other than maybe it was you throw it in your jacket pocket and take it with you wherever you go.
Yeah. Mark Dreisenstock, who's the editor of the Scottish Rite Journal, and I talked about that privately. And what we came up with, the theory is that it likely was just we wanted to compete with the Reader's Digest. I mean, you know, it was a very popular publication. And so we said, well, why not sort of cater to what's popular and convert it to a smaller pocket-sized version?
Now, I can't speak to earlier iterations of the Scottish Rite Journal, which again came in the late 80s and continues today.
Yeah.
But the Scottish Rite Journal, its writing style, its presentation, everything about it is very modern, very slick, very contemporary.
Yes.
But the New Age magazine is an entirely different beast, written for an entirely different audience. And the first page of the first article that we looked at shows that. And so, I mean, it was just a very different mindset, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think you made a really good example of saying that it's like the National Geographic. I mean, so even when we were trying to find articles to cover in these podcasts, I was going through about decades for just trying to pick some really good ones. And you're talking about articles about science. You're talking about articles about, there was a whole section, a running section on just like drama and plays and theater, like national theater. The first publication, I think, was in June 1904. They were talking about, half of them were stories, like novellas, like fiction kind of stories, not even related to Scottish Rite. You know, there was one about an artist or a traveler. So, and then sort of towards the back of the book, you would have interesting things that were going on around the community, the Masonic community, things that people would submit to say, hey, you know, there's things coming up. In fact, in one of the early editions, we were talking about Knights Templar, there was a recap of the triennial. Now imagine, you know, the Scottish Rite doing a recap of another organization. That was the kind of things that they were contributing and putting into the magazine.
Brother Matt Bowers.
So was part of that with all of the information that had nothing to do with Masonry leading up to the stuff at the end of the magazine that did, was that because they were just kind of flying by the seat of their pants in the beginning? They didn't know what to put in there completely content-wise?
Yeah.
Or was it more to just reel people in and get them interested in a new magazine overall?
I think it's the latter. I think that they were George Moore, who was the editor at the time, then eventually becomes Grand Commander. His goal was just to actually make this something that you wanted to read and your wife wanted to read and your family would want to read. This was not just a function of like, here's just, for example, before the New Age magazine, Albert Pike basically wrote the Scottish Rite Bulletin. He did it himself.
Which is probably more like a trestle board.
Correct.
Type of thing,
That's right. For
the
the entire organization. And so he pulled things that were just meetings, transcribes of events. When someone died, he would have their, a little memorial. And it was just like Pike saying, like, let's just put everything together and put it out there. And then for like a couple decades, after Pike died, there was very few of these types of publications. And then until the New Age. But they went a different way. They said, well, what do people find interesting? Well, they like stories. They like the Masonic stuff, obviously. And so why don't we get a little mix of both? And you can tell by the sort of stories that you see in those early editions, there's travel-related stuff. There are things about science and technology. My favorite article, or my favorite series of articles, was this recurring thing on just science. Professor X from Baltimore is coming up with this new invention. John Smith from Y patent this thing in, California.
Well, in fairness, Professor X would have started a school for special gifted young people.
I didn't even look at that.
You said it.
I know.
You said it.
And I'm
the comic book nerd,
and he pounced on it.
That's right.
We're definitely going to have a little fun here.
Yeah.
Here's as Masons,
Yes.
the 7 liberal arts and sciences are supposed to be part of our method of improving ourselves to learn more about them.
Right.
So I'm guessing that it had, and again, this is speculation on my part, I'm guessing that there had to be an element of, if we're going to tell Masons they need to be better educated in the 7 liberal arts and sciences, perhaps we should provide that in much the same way that we say now to people, if you're going to be a learned Scottish Rite Mason and improve yourself in Scottish Rite Masonry, you need to do things like the Master Craftsman program. You need to read things like Bridge to Light and Morals and Dogma and so on. One thing I am curious about, the language in these articles has a level of sophistication that I would say is beyond the grasp of a lot of newer Masons in particular, not to mention just the general audience of today. I don't want to say that people have dumbed things down, but we have a much more efficient way of speaking. There's a lot of extra words in some of these articles where, and 50-cent words where you could get by with a dime and a nickel. The thing I wonder about is, when you or I hear something like this, people who've been in the craft for over a decade and have wrapped our head around Mason speak, so to speak.
Yeah.
Does that make it less accessible? Matt's a little newer to the craft. He's a lot newer to the craft. He's been a Mason about a year. Matt, when you read some of these things, did you find it accessible, or is this something that you're having to kind of wrap your head around a little bit? Because I'll tell you, there was a couple of times when I was reading it and I was like, let me read that sentence again. That was, what the heck is he saying there?
Well, considering most of what I do already with the Scottish Rite Journal podcast, I'm doing a ton of reading and reciting on top of that. After doing that for a year, I've gotten a little bit used to it. The one thing I've noticed with older articles like this, even in the Scottish Rite Journal, people back then were far more literate.
Yeah.
You didn't have Netflix, Prime, all that stuff. You could either watch grass grow
You're
or
saying
read.
They would read. Yeah.
And because that was your source of entertainment. You watch a show like Peaky Blinders, which is set, during post-World War I. And what's everyone doing if they're not talking to one another or drinking? They've got a newspaper open. Right. So even the poorest person, to an extent, had a level of literacy back then that if you think the most educated person, their verbiage was probably beyond what most of us use today. And we speak more today in vernacular, not that they didn't back then, but we speak more today in vernacular probably than anything.
And I think you alluded to something before that, which was that you're starting to see some of that now. And I think we are going back to that. I think we're going back to that slightly long form storytelling. Even if it's nonfiction, it's a little bit more of that. From, I want to say from like the 40s all the way on to maybe like, during Brent's year when he became the editor and was really working on this stuff.
Dr. S. Brent Morris.
That's right. When Brent was working on this, it sort of evolved into, small form, more like newspaper style, right? Like, I want to give you the information as efficiently as possible. Here's some interesting stuff, really focused on that. We seem to be going the other way now. We seem to be going back to like, tell me a story. Here's an interesting biography. It's a little bit of a longer form. There's a lot more on philosophy and politics and esoterica rather than There was a meeting in, some valley. Here's what happened. Here's the check that we received. Congratulations to these brethren. We're moving away from the news format, the U.S. sort of Post, New York Times kind of format, into more long form. So imagine we're moving away from the New York Times into the New Yorker.
So let's get into the first article that Chris has selected here. And Chris is, like I said at the beginning, Chris is the guy that digitized all of these. So he has got the most familiarity with these articles. And so he has taken on the unenviable task of choosing which ones we're going to take a look at. And the first one is titled The Study of Character in America by William Rounsville. I hope I'm saying that correct. Alger, 33rd degree honorary. I'm guessing that he's no longer with us, but
this was
very interesting.
September 1904.
Now, what made you select this article?
Well, so I went through what I really wanted to take a look at some of the older editions, right?
Sure.
The first sort of sets. And by the way, one of the things I didn't mention earlier on in our introduction was that the first either 5 years or first 10 years, this was a publication for both the Northern Masonic jurisdiction and the Southern jurisdiction. So this publication said Supreme Council, but it was published in New York. It wasn't until the Grand Commander Moore became the Grand Commander that he moved the press down to D.C. and then was publishing as the official. So you'll see the masthead of the publication change from, I think, for science, literature, and art over to the official publication of the Supreme Council.
Oh, interesting.
So you're covering the entire Scottish Rite universe with that publication. Now, I really like the study of character in America. Matt, you touched upon it. When I was looking for articles, I was trying to find, number one, things that were timely,
right,
things that were relevant, things that we can talk about today. And I think I didn't say that to you when I forwarded this over. But what did you think when you read this? What you just said it before we started recording.
Yeah, just the title of the article, The Study of Character in America. In this day and age, it's a straight punch to the face.
Right.
We were talking last night at our lodge meeting, myself and a couple other brothers, and the comment, we live in one of the most informed yet least educated periods.
Right.
There's so much information out there, but we take so little time to most people to dig deep and find it.
Right.
And so many people are just so engrossed in, it's a swipe left world.
Yeah.
It's really a swipe left world, and you're not digging deep to find more information to better yourself, not just as a Mason, just as a person.
Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and take a listen to the article. And again, the date on this one, September 1904.
1904.
And it is The Study of Character in America by William Rounsville Alger, 33rd degree. Brother Matt?
The study of pure, rich, original character is the most delicate and complex, the most important and remunerative of all studies, since it is only through a knowledge of human nature and experience that we can arrive at the knowledge of God. Yet here in America, under the externalizing and pulverizing influence of our material strifes and democratic averages, this study seems to be the one in which the least interest is felt. Character is the physical mold and die in which personalities strike the crude material of life into the finished coinage of experience. Experience, therefore, is the fruit and test of character, and in the last resort, what else is there which has any real interest for those endowed with genuine insight? Our most exalted achievement in the very highest province of knowledge is such an understanding of the character and exponents of those we meet as will enable us to form a correct estimate of their ranks in the scale of intrinsic worth, and to bear ourselves toward them accordingly. But careful discrimination in this respect was perhaps never at such a discount in civilized society as now. Think of the social prominence of individuals and study of character in France at the epoch of Louis XIV or in England in the reign of Elizabeth. With us today, outward affairs absorb attention. The superlative interior interests are overlooked in behalf of accidental matters. Never before was there such an undisguised neglect of spiritual grades and distinctions among persons, such as miscellaneous thronging and lumping together of all kinds of men and women in one level medley. The more richly sensitive in spirit one is, and the more intensely devoted to pure ends, so much the more rigorously he will apply the test of fitness to his associates. But what now is the condition for fellowship in the more coveted circles of our country at the present day? In determining whether the acquaintance of a given person is worth seeking, the primary questions are not, as they surely should be, how refined, gifted, and noble is he? How honest and sympathetic, wise and magnanimous is he? How learned and accomplished? How experienced and consecrated and aspiring? No, the inquiry is limited for the most part to his social and pecuniary status. Let a man be a self-pushing, adroit manager. All the self-seekers gather and fawn on him. Let him have the unmoral skill and force to wring a fortune out of other people. General attention and adulation are at his beck. But let a man of rare and lofty spirit, turning away from meaner considerations, unobtrusively devote his life to the supreme ends of existence, sacrificing every vulgar passion and spurning every unworthy indulgence, heroically toiling to grasp the highest experiences possible to man in this world. He will be left utterly to himself, uncheered by recognition, either to conquer through divine grace alone, or with a baffled heart to perish in neglect. His one resource is to fall back on that infinite solace never denied to anyone worthy of it, the refuge known by all the sublimest spirits in past history, the society of his own soul in fellowship with nature, ideal humanity, and God. The full possession of himself in this companionship amply suffices him. But it is quite clear that the community which honors selfish ambition and material success first, and flatters conventionality and frivolity most, while it completely overlooks the highest representations of personal nobility and spiritual attainment, does not furnish favorable conditions for the production of genius and excellence, but only stimulate the multiplying growth of mediocrity. In such a nation, plebeianism will be equally profuse, rampant, and complacent. It cannot be otherwise. This truth is not hidden from careful observers by all the efforts which the conspicuous class make to drown the discords of their hollow civilization with noisy shams. Our most distinguished visitors and critics from abroad, such as Prince de Joinville and Matthew Arnold, note this glaring fault and regretfully declare that distinctive originality, marked peaks of genius, exceptional refinement of character, and achievements sought intrinsically for their own sake are sorely lacking, all being merged in the prevailing lead of general classes. What America wants is a development on the spiritual side, correspondent to the wealth and energy of the superabundant material side. A larger supply of modesty, aspiration, reflection, sincerity, faith, and above all, cooperative friendship and ideal pursuits. The principal condition which has stimulated every such concentrated flowering epoch of genius, as the Periclean or the Medician age, has been the existence of an intensely appreciated and admiring public whose attention and applause were focalized on the gifted spirits of the time. No man of extraordinary genius or worth would have been allowed to live unrenowned in Athens at the time of Plato, in Florence at the time of Leonardo da Vinci, in Paris at the time of the Hotel Rambouillet, in London at the time of Bacon and Shakespeare. The intense civic pride prevalent and the extreme interest felt in character would have discerned and advanced him to the front. But today, in New York, in Philadelphia, in Washington, in New Orleans, in San Francisco, in Chicago, or in Boston, a man of the deepest insight, the most comprehensive knowledge, the purest aims, the richest personality, and the greatest capacity for usefulness is quite certain, in default of the coarse egotism which makes its possessor force himself into notice, to be obscured and impeded by envious mediocrities, and to receive no encouragement or attention whatever from the general public or its leaders. Among the glittering pretenders, the obtrusive idlers, and the thronging nobodies, he will come in and go out unrecognized as anything more than one of the common crowd. In such a state of society, spirits of superior refinement and dignity languish in neglect and die of imaginative inanition, unless great enough to draw inspiration from the infinite dweller, within. The reckless rush and scramble for wealth, the disproportioned passion for publicity, the frittering externality and sensual dissipation which rule alike in the fashionable and in the industrial life of the nation, exert a vulgarizing power which goes far to neutralize the unparalleled opportunities and inspiring liberty enjoyed by our people. A community which patronizes the superficialists and charlatans who cater to its tastes, and which scarcely deigns to notice the seers and the saints who would guide it to something better, sets a premium on commonplaces and imposture. The results are obvious in every direction. Literature grows more and more fragmentary and ephemeral with the dejected and clamorous multitude of its organs. The childishness of the illustrated newspapers which cannot report a murder without giving half a dozen woodcuts of the falsified details tends to babyize the public mind. Amusement takes the place of instruction. The sensualized theater pushes the conventionalized church aside, and spirituality and earnestness threaten entirely to disappear. Of course, in all this, only one side of the picture is presented, and that a side which we may hope is destined but for a temporary predominance. In the meanwhile, however, it demands serious heed. Privilege imposes obligation. On this principle, it is the duty of the leisure class in our country to set a better example. It is their duty to show themselves worthy of their gifts and their exemptions. For if opinions begin at the bottom of society and slowly rise to the top, manners begin at the top and swiftly go down to the bottom. And manners govern the world much more than opinions do. The mayor of Boston a few years ago presided at a great public meeting held to present a $10,000 gold belt to a champion prize fighter. One of the most cultivated thinkers of the country gave a public lecture in one of its chief cities on the ideal of personal perfection, and the proceeds did not meet the expenses. Many such contrasts occur every day. They should be inverted. The attention, the time, the money now squandered by the leisure class on cigars, liquors, games, pugilistic clubs, races, and banquets where the most prominent, but by no means the worthiest, citizens ventilate themselves in speeches whose staple is a coarse chaffing of the audience, if bestowed on really befitting ends, might transform the whole temper of the country in one generation. Heaven knows it is badly needed enough, for the reverential recognition of superiority is becoming obsolete in this arid and sterilizing atmosphere of materialistic competition and social badinage. Nothing else is so unpopular with the average American as that which makes him feel his inferiority. Nothing else is so popular as that which stirs complacent laughter in him. The American citizen has the most self-assertive individuality and the greatest freedom and fearlessness ever known since organized society grew up. So far, so good, perhaps. Now let him add to his outfit modesty, faith, reverence, ideal refinement, some proper sense of the infinity of his nature, and an obedient recognition of his personal and national responsibility, both before God and before mankind. In this direction, the great exposition now open in St. Louis gives birth to new hopes. Those hopes are doomed to bitter disappointment if mere material triumphs and egotistical exaltations shall be allowed to fill the bill and rule the hour. There is good promise that they will not be suffered to do so. One fresh condition for a deep intellectual life, for a pure ethical loyalty, for a truer imaginative impulse, and for a richer religious insight is of greater consequence than 100 additional methods of production or facilities of trade and gain. An exhibition may cost scores of millions of dollars and be of little high or enduring use. An influence may cost only a little light of intuition and a little openness of soul, yet prove of illimitable service. Do we not suppose the single sentence spoken by Christ, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," has yielded more benefit and is of greater value to mankind than the whole line of Egyptian kings, with all their battles and pageants? Is it auspicious for Americans that in the present celebration ample provision, as I suppose, has been made for something higher and deeper than the mere display of the triumphs of physical discovery and the marvels of machinery and its fabrics? Various congresses of science, art, literature, reform, philosophy, and religion are to be held, as I understand, on a scale like that inaugurated at Chicago, far transcending everything of the kind ever attempted before. The intellectual and moral aspects and ministrations of the Cosmopolitan Convention in session at St. Louis therefore promises to be its chief glory. And so we will all trust that the gigantic and munificent enterprise will not pass away without depositing a diffusive and permanent influence on the artistic and spiritual elevation of the American people, nor without starting many generous impulses which shall vibrate beneficently throughout the whole world.
The Study of Character in America by William Brownsville Alger, 33rd degree honorary. The New Age Magazine, September 1904. Read there by the voice of the Scottish Rite Journal and now the voice of the New Age Masonic Podcast, Brother Matt Bowers, 18th degree. Probably by the time this is published, you'll be a 32nd degree, but I'm not giving it to you.
Fair enough.
I'm just not.
Fair enough.
And good on you for doing it. Some valleys just have, some valleys just do like 1 or 2 day conferrals or reunions. So the fact that you're an 18th degree and only an 18th degree, that's awesome.
1 week at a time, baby.
Look at that.
1 week
Good for you, man. Good for you.
So this is pretty critical of the idea that America is sort of losing its moral character. And Chris, you have read this a bunch of times and really digested it more than the rest of us. What's your takeaway from this? What are your thoughts on this one?
Well, one of the things that I really liked about the article, and one of the reasons why I picked it, was not only because it's timely, but I think you got to apply the context of when it was written, right? So Alger here says, or at least the little biography below his name says he's the author of Critical History of the Doctrine of a Future Life. Now, I'm not really, I will admit, never read the book, not really sure if it's out there. I'd be curious to read it. But one of the things that he's talking about, he's going in, he's basically saying, again, in the context of the time that this was written, United States or the society of the United States somehow has lost its way. He's saying the Americans are some of the most individualistic people or societies out there, but we sort of moved away from, I'm going to say, the sort of principles of education, thrift. He says this: education, thrift, humility, faith, etc. What is he talking about? Well, at the time that this was written, and let's assume that he's, in his 20s or 30s, he's gone through the Gilded Age. He's talking about an America out past the Civil War, after the Civil War, where there's extreme wealth inequality, especially in Washington, D.C., where you have lavish parties, and on the other end of that, there are neighborhoods where people could barely get by. So he's talking about a period of extreme inequality. In fact, there's a really good part at the end of this, sort of on page 293, the last part, where he says, take this as an example. The mayor of Boston a few weeks ago presided at a great public meeting held to present a $10,000 gold belt to a champion prize fighter. One of the most cultivated thinkers of the country gave a public lecture in one of its chief cities on the ideal of personal perfection, and the proceeds did not even meet the expenses. What he's talking about is, look at the things that the society venerates or is finding interesting or puts its value on. He's saying this prized fighter is getting a $10,000 gold belt. Meanwhile, this intellectual who was doing a presentation and a great thinker was barely covering. In fact, he didn't cover his expenses. He had to put money down to even have this lecture. So, he's talking about there is a systemic issue, there's a change, there's a shift going on, and what he's trying to do is highlight that and then talk about what we can do to sort of fix it.
I think he's full of it.
You think he's full of it?
Yeah, and I'll reserve.
Tell me. No, go
I'll
ahead.
reserve my commentary. I want to hear
hot
what
take.
Matt has
Here's
to
the
say.
hot take.
No, it's not all that hot. It's an actual ancient take. But
In regard to what
It's
Chris
a stone cold. It's a
or
stone
about
cold
the
take.
letter in general.
well,
I'm doing a little radio tease, as we used to say,
hi-yo.
saying that I think he's full of crap.
there are a couple of them. One, just on that same page, and Chris alluded to this a second ago, the American citizen has the most self-assertive individuality and greatest freedom and fearlessness ever known since organized society grew up. So far, so good, perhaps. Freedom and fearlessness don't necessarily mean entitlement to do whatever you think is okay.
Right.
This is a study of character, and a study of character for me. And I'll admit, if I were to die tomorrow, and my headstone had my name and my birth date and my death date, underneath of it, it would say irreverent, because that's my sense of humor.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that's my overall character.
Sure.
And what is okay to do, what isn't okay to do, the buttons that I push, the buttons that I don't push, you know. Fearlessness, well, some people equate fearlessness, well, I sometimes think some people figure fearlessness, isn't stupidity.
Right.
Well, a lot of times it is, unfortunately. And just because you do it to get maybe likes or reposts or retweets, you weren't entitled to do that.
Here it comes.
I get annoyed.
Here it
by
comes.
The idea that we're all devolving. It's the good old days. We have a tendency to lament the modern time, whatever that time might be, and talk about how great the good old days were. And whenever I hear that, I'm reminded of a story from the Constitutional Convention, I think 1789. It might have been 1787, but the date is unimportant as to the anecdote. There was a lot of argument going on as to how the new government should be formed, and the things in Philadelphia were getting rather heated. And there was a lot of fighting back and forth and screaming and yelling, and Venerable Benjamin Franklin, Grand Master, Brother Benjamin Franklin, stands. He's an elderly man, the elder statesman, the most respected man, save for Washington, perhaps in the history of our country. And he stands and he says, "Gentlemen, perhaps now is the time that we take a moment and ask for the blessing of our God and say a moment of prayer." You know what happened? They gavelled him down and told him to shut up. Ben Franklin, asking for a moment of calm and prayer in the midst of the Constitutional Convention. Things are now as they have always been and as they will always be. There will always be this idea that things are not as good now as they once were. And we tend to forget that. And I think that it's no different then as it is today. If you reading this article could be published today.
Right.
And with the exact same complaint. But this article also could have been published in the early 1700s with the exact same complaint.
Sure.
If you read early lodge minutes and things, or you read some of the notes from, let's say, the Masonic Baltimore conventions and things like that, or some of the sidebars and things that they have, the complaints there were, what are we going to do to get brothers to come back to lodge? The craft is fading. And it is now as it has always been and always will be. Yeah. There will always be a handful of people who revere these things, these enlightened things that tend to move us forward as character, as is mentioned in here. But, the prize fighter and the athlete and the actor in some way, shape, or form is always going to garner more attention. And I think it's in human nature to be attracted to that. And I think in Morals and Dogma and in other places, it's referred to as, the mob. And the idea of the Mason is that we're trying to purposefully set ourselves apart from the mob. And for us as men, and this brother to set that aside and say, we're going to set ourselves aside, but then to complain that everybody else hasn't, well, pick a lane, man.
So are you saying that as Masons, we should be a little bit more not individualist, but sort of apply a lens of criticism on these things and go, I don't know, man. I don't know about this.
I think what we need to do is we need to not complain about it. I think it's not for us to, we have to...
Well, not, if you don't mind me interrupting for a second. When I think part of the reason why we complain about it, though, is because we want to know why. When you talk about the prize fighter or the actor being something more accessible for us, it's easier to get because of where they are in their life. But anything that's bad or negative, it's not as accessible because we're constantly going, well, why?
You can replace prize fighter with social media influencer.
Social media influencer,
absolutely.
Football player.
Correct.
movie star,
Right.
Even best-selling author to a certain extent.
Sure.
You know, I mean, that's
Sure.
a little slightly different, but you know, once you get to be the point of a Stephen King or you know, James Patterson, where you're a cult figure,
Yeah.
a cultural personality as opposed to just an author at that point. I think it's the resentment by the air quotes mob of the simple but not easy principle that we all have to contend with on a day-to-day basis. You know, I sit here recording this a solid 25 or 30 pounds overweight, just, you know, lazy COVID weight and Christmas and all those kinds of things. It's simple to lose weight. It's just not easy. It is simple to become a learned person. You just start doing it, but it's not easy. And so I think that principle, the, again, air quotes, mob just says, I don't, that's hard. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But then they see this guy punching someone in a ring, as the example the brother gives there. That is something that, you know, in the back of your mind, you think, I could probably knock that guy out. Or I could do that. I want to do what Brad Pitt's doing. I want to do what those guys are doing. And I think that is the social media influencer is a perfect example that Chris gave. Is like, I can take pictures of myself in my underpants and put it online and make $1 million. I should be able to pull that off. And so we gravitate towards that.
Maynard, please don't do that. I know you're not.
late.
I'm just saying, please don't do that.
Yeah, I second that.
Yeah.
You know, the Masonic OnlyFans page.
That's oh boy. I mean,
Oh,
I'm telling you.
boy. Yeah,
Talk about a pyramid scheme.
Hey, listen, man.
What does the G stand for?
No,
Masonic OnlyFans.
off.
I will say this. We did have a thought of a lodge fundraiser once, so we're going to take pictures of all of us at our various professions just wearing the apron. And here was
Oh, it's like one of those firemen calendars
but
or something.
Be just the apron.
Oh, jeez.
And then here's how it is: either give us $50, or we're coming to your work and hanging this up. And we're only going to have to print like 3 calendars and just take them to different places.
It'd be a great Weight Watchers ad.
Either give us some money, or we're going to put this up at your office.
Oh no.
But I grow weary of that complaint that things are everyone is so stupid now, and we didn't used to be stupid. No, we've always been stupid. We've always been stupid, and there've always been a handful of people who make the conscious decision to try and elevate beyond that. It is the same argument of, you know, especially over the last several years, and I don't want to go too far down the politics road on a Masonic podcast, but political discussion has gotten worse than it's ever been.
It's not true.
Not really.
That's not true.
And
We just see it. We're more aware of it now.
We don't
than
even
ever
have, you know,
before.
what was there? I actually don't remember the individuals' names, but there was a congressman who was caned in the House of Representatives, or it was Senator House of
I thought you were going to
Representatives.
say Singapore for a second.
No, he was literally beaten in the Capitol.
Yeah,
Wow.
well, and
It was around the time. I think this was around the time for the slave vote, which amendment for the slave vote.
people are shocked and saddened and upset by the assassination of Kennedy, and obviously a shocking and saddening event for the entire nation. But if you had been in Dallas on that day, shopkeepers who were not supporters of Kennedy put up posters of Kennedy's face with the crosshairs over it prior to him being shot, because they were like, we're done with this guy. He was not as popular then. In his death made him legendary.
Yeah.
And, you know, in much the same way that the argument is made that, you know, John Lennon dying made him a legend as opposed to a failing pop star. Same criticism could be made of Elvis Presley and things. So we view that with those rose-colored glasses, but we forget that there were people who really hated Kennedy and who were probably not saddened to see him go, regardless of how it went. But we today think, the people of the 50s and 60s, they were so polite in their discourse. Bull.
Yeah.
That's complete bull.
Yeah.
And this article, while I understand its tone and its tenor, I just think that lamenting that as though it's a new phenomenon is not credible.
Yeah.
So-
Well, one of the reasons why I selected this, again, because Matt said that, you know, it's still contemporary to the day, is actually that we find a lot of these things in those old articles. When I'm going through these, I'm like, this could be a plot. We can write this article today, change 2 words, literally maybe 1 or 2 words, and people are like, this is great. I can't believe this is such new and interesting information. I'm like, not really, because it was published 100 years ago when we had, you know, barely electricity. And I think he mentions. There's a part in the article when he's talking about, the Great St. Louis Exposition, one of the world's fairs. It was called the Louisiana Purchase Expositions, where they were, and I'm not joking, I actually went and Googled this, early fax machine, 1904.
I think
wireless
the ice cream cone, I think, was
wireless
invented there.
telephone, X-ray machine, automobile, and there was the first airship contest. That was 1904. I'm pretty sure fax machines, or at least the fax machines, the Xerox, weren't really technically invented, or at least the Xerox company didn't invent it, roll it out until the 1950s or 60s. So you're talking about early fax machines, wireless telephones. We were on cords, at least I was. My family had, one of the cord phones up until, we moved in the 2000s. So, I mean, we claim that you have all this interesting stuff.
But did you have a rotary phone?
I remember using a rotary phone, absolutely. But again, ask a Mason brother who just got initiated, or maybe 10 years later, and they're going to be like, what the hell is a rotary phone?
My kids don't know how to hold a phone properly. They don't hold a phone up, when you take your thumb and your pinky and you hold it to your ear and your mouth like you're making the phone. My kids don't
what
know
does that mean?
is. They have no idea because their phone, they hold like this and use the speakerphone more often than not. Actually, the kids FaceTime everything. They don't,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt.
No, please.
Here's a sentence in here I think is not BS. I think it's an important idea, and I like the way he expresses it. For if opinions begin at the bottom of society and slowly rise to the top, manners begin at the top and swiftly go down to the bottom. So, a good opinion rises to the surface and manners are slowly devolving over time. I can get on board with that. I'm
so pleased you mentioned that because I had that written down too.
I can get on board with that. I really believe that the best opinions, the best ideas tend to rise to the surface and continue.
Yeah.
But manners can be problematic.
Is it our job as Masons to help other brothers realize that? Or is that more of you should give the guys the tools to go read it themselves and learn it?
That's a great question. Matt, you take that one first. I have a thought, and I don't want to be all past mastery about the whole thing.
Past master yells at clouds.
Right. Repeat that again.
I haven't heard that one in a while.
Yeah.
Repeat that again.
It's a joke off of
No. What you? Your question.
Is it the fraternity or Masons? So for me, is it my job as a Mason to highlight and to tell you, hey man, about the manners thing, about like manners versus opinions?
Does Chris need to?
Is that part of the fraternity? Is that like one of the things? I know that's like there's obligations, of course, but I'm telling you as just from do you think that I should be telling you manner, like, hey man?
In private, yes.
Even in public, in a Masonic space.
Not to the individual. In public, no. In private, sure. But you don't want to embarrass somebody in public, regardless of what your intentions might be. I learned that the hard way in the past. I think we all have to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that. If you truly care for someone, you don't want to see them make bad decisions. You don't want to see them to continue to go down a path that could be bad for them and lead to worse things.
So here's the interesting thing about that. I've seen many references.
The only problem I have sometimes, maybe I shouldn't say the problem, but some people might perceive doing it on a group scale where you don't put the individual in the spotlight. Some people might take that as passive aggressive.
Okay, so here's the reason, and the only reason I asked this, or the reason I brought that up, because I've seen so many references to, and this is old, this is like 1904, 1800s, going through rare records of like, we brought Brother X up in front of the lodge. And we basically were like, we just dressed him up and down. We're like, we read him the riot act. Because like, why did you do this? Or, X, Y, Z. And it was not done as a way of like, we're not trying to embarrass you, but we're just trying to tell you like, this is not good, and you shouldn't do this. It's sort of like an intervention. Sure. There were Masonic interventions happening in lodge rooms all across the country, and there's minute records of that. I'm not saying I support it. I'm just saying, what do you think of that? Because you're saying I want to do that privately.
Well, yeah, and if you've done it, if you have a Masonic intervention, well, how long did you let it go before
to get to that point?
To get to that point, why would you let it go to get to that point? Why, because at a certain level, people are going to be going around to one another. Hey, did you hear about Chris? Hey, did you hear about Chris? Hey, did you hear about Chris? And then everyone makes that decision to do it as a group. Well, why didn't one brother just go up to him and say, "Hey, Chris, you good?"
Yeah, I wonder if that's more of a contemporary thing of like speaking privately.
I don't.
I mean, it's in the obligation, and again, we're trying not
Sure.
to. Obviously, we're not trying to get into the
Keep private.
Yeah. But I wonder how much of that is. There's some stuff we should keep privately, and there's some stuff that's not necessarily should be kept privately, but we can also do it in front of the lodge. Like, hey, man, this is a learning session for everybody. I wonder how much is that.
I think for a past master or a master mason, in terms of dealing with those who are an entered apprentice or even a candidate and a fellow craft or even a newly made master mason, I think the answer is yes, but.
Right.
And let me explain. When you're brought into a lodge, we teach that masonry does not regard you for your worldly wealth or honor. It is not about how much money you have, how you dress, or anything like that. Yet, when you come to lodge, we expect you to be dressed for a business meeting. We expect you to be dressed appropriately. So even in that, there is some gentle education. We don't really care about your station in life, whether you're a garbage man or an attorney, which people could say are the same thing. Right. What you have to do is you have to show up your best for this occasion. Okay, you have to come, whatever that might be, and I think there is some gentle instruction in that, and I think that we do that at the early part of a mason's travels. Once you become a master mason, the language is actually given to us in the ritual, and this ritual is 300 years old, or it's part of the old charges. It is to whisper good counsel to a brother. You're not supposed to bring it up all loud and everything. You're supposed to aid him in getting better as a person, but it's specific to whisper that. It's not something that's meant to call out Bowers, or call out Chris, or call out Maynard in a big, gross setting. Now, we're not under that same obligation, so to speak, even though it's not part of the obligation. We're not under that same charge, if you will, to entered apprentices and fellow craft, because it is our job to instruct them. So I think there's a caveat there. My personal feeling is, generally speaking, we should try and be good examples and set good examples as often as possible by living by those tenets and by living by those manners that we are taught. And then if we see somebody who's way out where the buses don't run with that, if it's a younger brother, I still think you'd whisper good counsel, because you don't want to embarrass, like you said, you don't want to embarrass somebody. But at the same time, if somebody's walking around and shouting that they're a Mason and behaving poorly, and we see this all the time with guys that should not have Masonic emblems on the back of their car. It's possible one of them is talking right now. You whisper that good counsel. Right. So that's my take on it.
Just to loop it back to the Alger piece and the study of the character, I really appreciate that. There's a spot that I really liked that I wanted to talk to you about, because you said, okay, it doesn't matter what your station is, blah, 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 blah. He says, the attention, the time, the money now squandered by the leisure class on cigars, liquors, games, clubs, races, and banquets, where the most prominent, but by no means the worthiest, citizens ventilate themselves in speeches whose staple is a coarse chaffing of the audience, if bestowed on really befitting ends, might transform the whole temper of the country in one generation. So what he's basically saying is, and by the way, he's publishing this to a Masonic audience, right? Mm-hmm. He's basically saying, well, we say these things. We're saying that, when you come and become a Mason, we take anyone. But at the same time, he's also saying, okay, and I can say this in the DC context as a DC Mason, DC researcher. There were a lot of banquets in a lot of social engagements and a lot of extremely prominent Masonic figures who were doing all the things that you're talking about, the private clubs, the cigars, and making broad speeches about things and making broad speeches to an audience of similar like folk. And so I think that might be a criticism of, I think he might be, what he's trying to do politely, because I'm sure he wants to come back and write again, but he's slightly criticizing some of the more overt or public parts of the craft, mm-hmm. right? So I'm not sure how I've always squared that, because when people come to me and say, "Oh yeah, you're one of the Masons, right? You do all these things, right?"
It's 100%.
It's a dichotomy. It's a conflict.
That's being kind. I mean, there's some hypocrisy involved, certainly, because, and this is, I'm the degree master for the 15th degree, and in my valley, and it's one of my favorite degrees, and I've done several parts in it, so I'm really familiar with its lessons and things. And at the end of it, Zerubbabel, who is charged with rebuilding the Second Temple, he's been released and gotten King Cyrus to release the Hebrews so that they can return to Jerusalem and rebuild the Second Temple with him. And before he leaves, Cyrus gives him sort of a decoration of nobility and makes him the governor of Jerusalem.
Right.
The governor of Jerusalem. That's easy for you to say. And by the time Zerubbabel gets to Jerusalem, he's been involved in a few different skirmishes and has lost this decoration of nobility. And he says, essentially, well, it doesn't matter. It was just a decoration of nobility. It's no big. These things are worthless trash. It's not that I didn't appreciate it, but it doesn't matter. And Pike goes on in Morals and Dogma about this, about how these awards and these decorations are, they're a little bit folly and there's some silliness.
Right.
And yet, there are dozens of pictures of Pike with his chest covered in medals, like he single-handedly won the Spanish-American War. I mean, he's just covered in regalia, covered in medals and things. And so how do we square that idea of these decorations of nobility don't matter, and yet we have so many of them? I mean, we have so very many of them. How do we square that?
Well, isn't it just made to be a distinction?
But if we're all on the level, are some of us more level than others? Are all animals equal, or are some of us more equal than others? It's the George Orwell question. How do we square that bit of Masonic paradox if we're being nice and hypocrisy if we're not? So it's a good question, and I say that I certainly wear my medals, I wear my pins. How do we square that as people?
Well, in this article, Alger's basically saying you sort of have to add a little bit more faith and humility to those conversations, and he says that the American citizen is a self-assertive individual.
That was the one I was looking at. That's the best paragraph in this whole writing. Yeah. The American citizen has the most self-assertive individuality, the greatest freedom and fearlessness ever known since organized society grew up. So far, so good, perhaps. Now let him add to his outfit modesty, faith, reverence, ideal refinement, some proper sense of the infinity of his nature, and the obedient recognition of his personal national responsibility before God and mankind. That is a heck of a... That should have been his final paragraph right there. I agree with. We should be that. Not just as Americans, but specifically as Masons.
So how do you then, if there are any Grandmasters listening to this presentation or this podcast?
Get us in trouble already.
No. What I'm saying is, no. My question is, how do you serve as a humble Grandmaster, or how do you apply or leverage? Not even Grandmaster. Excuse me. I should have been any leader in any Masonic context. How do you serve, or what are the ways that you keep yourself humble?
You serve from in front. You don't serve from behind. You don't stand at the back of the boat and bark orders. You stand at the bow of the boat and row faster than everybody else. You don't stand at the back and say, "Come on, boys, let's row." You get at the front of the boat and you're rowing just as fast as everybody else and yelling back to everybody, "Come on, guys, let's go." You have to lead by leading, as opposed. There's a difference between boss and leader. And I think that there's this idea in Masonry of, well, when it's my year, when I'm in charge, I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. Yeah. It's not your year; it's the year, and it's your job to serve the craft.
Right.
And I've seen worshipful masters and leaders of Masonic organizations who do that and are very successful, and then I've seen the ones who bark at the back of the boat and bark orders to others that are also successful. I just think one is the more Masonic way than the other, and so that's my opinion. As someone who's sat in the chair a few times, you have to lead by. If somebody's there washing dishes and you're not at least offering to help, you're not doing the right thing. You're just not. You as the master of your lodge, as the leader in your lodge, you should endeavor to have your boots on the ground first and be the last to leave. It's which frankly sucks, but that's the job that you took.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not president of a company where you've got these people working for you. This is a volunteer organization, and we're all here to try and make ourselves better. So I think you have to lead that example. Is my specific to your question, how do you remain humble? That's how, through service, through continued service, as opposed to indulging too far down the rabbit hole of awards and rubber chicken dinners. So to speak.
How does one have a conversation when it's not the case? Or do you have a conversation? Or is it more of, is it an individual thing? Is it, I mean, we're talking about character rather than behavior. Like, what in one's character, if you have high character, do you engage with that person directly, privately? I'm not saying like do it. Or is it you get a group of guys together and say, hey, listen, like, here's what I've observed.
Fantastic.
I don't
question.
know. And I'm not saying that there is an answer.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a case by case basis, Matt.
I think you tend to get, again, I think you get better buy-in when you do it individually, when you can have a one-on-one conversation.
You get better buy-in if you do it individually.
Yeah.
Okay.
I that's always been my experience. And once you have that buy-in and that individual puts it in motion, as others start to see it, I think it's appreciated more. They'll react to that person differently.
Yeah, I think though one of Chris's
and by differently I mean positively. Sorry.
When people get to a certain point in their Masonic leadership journey, if you will, they become less and less likely to be willing to hear others. Not everyone. I think there are cases. Let's say I think there.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
not
most
general.
people do. And I listen. Everyone is trying their best. Every brother, whether
Right.
he is a brand new entered apprentice or he is, grandmaster for 10 years. I don't know who'd want to do that for 10 years, but but
Go check out my Benjamin B. French video.
Benjamin
you
B.
can talk about
French,
Benjamin
Thomas
B.
J.
French.
Shryock. There are several examples of guys who did it for a long time. But, I think that it becomes that nobody wants to tell you what you don't want to hear, and you stop getting good information. That's one of the criticisms of leaders like Putin or the leadership in China, is that they're making bad decisions because they're not getting good information, because people are afraid to tell them the truth, and because they're afraid of the back. I'm not going to tell that guy the truth. He's going to lob my head clean off.
And that's also in business. That can be applied in business.
Anywhere.
That's
anywhere.
not just
a dictator's
political.
A dictator.
But
Yeah.
But it works both ways for Putin, because he's sitting at the end of a very long desk with to keep a group of people from killing him if they didn't like him.
But I totally hear what Chris is saying, though. It's like, how do you approach someone who is not behaving properly as a leader without causing yourself harm? Because if that guy's gonna tear up your dues card or something like that, it's a tough situation. You're 100% right.
That's a risk you run.
Well, but if you do it in a way that's respectful.
Well, yeah, you don't roll up on somebody, grab him by the arm, yank him into an office,
Bill,
and go,
you suck at this job.
right?
Yeah.
you
don't say that.
it's just not the way to do
Yeah,
it.
no, I think whisper good counsel is the way to go, but I think, and very mindfully. But Masonry has safeguards built in place for that. Your terms are limited. You're only going to be Grandmaster or Master or, Venerable Master or Wise Master or whatever for a finite period of time. And there's the election process that if they're acting truly inappropriately, the craft can get them out. And we've seen examples of that over the last several years
Right.
in Masons and Grand Lodges around the country. So, but it's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
And it's one that I think that I don't know that there's a good answer for.
Do you think that the Masonic principles are relevant? Not relevant. Let me do that again. Do you think the Masonic principles are commonplace in society today? Do you think that we are talking about this, right? We're talking about the liberal arts and sciences. There are colleges that are strictly dedicated to the liberal arts and sciences. They are putting out, students and, alums who are, people that have studied the liberal arts and sciences. Do you think, Masonry is not special in that it's the only thing that's talking about those things or those principles, but do you think that we are applying them externally better than some other organizations are, or do you think that it's just more of an individual thing? We can't really say.
That's another good question. Generally, I think Masons do a better job than the average bear. I really think that Masons do, or at least try to do a better job than most, especially in terms of things like manners and, education and personal conduct and so on and so forth. Do I think it's as bad as social media and or traditional media might have us believe? I don't. And the reason is, and I was with my daughter, and I remember this happening. It was at the height of some of the protests in 2020, And I mean, it just seemed like every time you turned on TV, everyone was at each other's throats between the COVID protests and the protests surrounding the death of George Floyd, and so many different things, and all the political protests going on because of the election. I mean, it just seemed like everywhere you went, you were just itching for a fight. And I remember going into Baltimore and went into a store, and there were a lot of folks in there, and just everyone was super polite and, hey, have a great day. And it was one of the first trips we had made to a store since sort of the world reopened. And it was just great. It was just a great experience. And it was different kinds of people. There were, the part of town I was in. So it was, myself, and I'm a white guy. I'm a waspy as it gets. And, there were a lot of African Americans there. There were, it was a fairly diverse group that was at that particular store at that moment. And people were super polite to one another, holding doors and please and thank you and all that. And I walked out, and I remembered to make a point to say to my daughter, don't believe what's on TV. Every person in there was super nice to us.
Right.
There's probably one person in there who might be angry about one thing in particular or upset about one thing in particular. But generally speaking, most people are good.
Yeah.
Not to sound like an old Luke Bryan song, but generally speaking, most people are good people and want to be good people. Do I think Masons do a little bit better job? I think they do, because we are taught to make a habit of it, especially Scottish Rite Masons. That's Pike's whole thing, is that being good and being moral and being a right person is a habit. It's not something you just are or are not. It is a habit that you go through every day. And I think that most people are, air quotes, good, but I think Masons probably try a little harder.
Yeah.
So that's my take on it, just purely my opinion. What do you think? You asked the question.
Well, is it like for those who've ever read or watched Moneyball, it's sort of like, is it like a statistical thing? Is it like Masons are statistically just better in terms of those those types of engagements versus someone who wasn't? I think generally speaking, I think it's better to be liberally arts educated. I'm not saying go to a liberal arts college, but just be a Mason, and that you were taught those things and they were told, you should probably check these out because these are really important. I think that type of education, either through the college or through Masonry, makes you a better person in general. In fact, one of the things I didn't realize, I actually had to go back and look it up because I didn't believe this brother at first, was most doctors in the United States, it fluctuates every year, of course, but most doctors gets liberal arts degrees before going to med school. They're not going, obviously they're going pre-med and then med school, but the thing that they do before, most of the time, go to St. John's in I think it's in Annapolis or
St. John's College in Annapolis.
They're putting out doctors. Now they're going pre-med, they're doing the medical arm later, but some of those guys or gals are starting in liberal arts and sciences.
Yeah, St. John's College though is a high school, but they are a liberal arts high school. So very interesting. And
they start in that process.
So, do you have something? No. Okay. Good.
Actually, well, if we were to put fear into someone to maintain the right path, I think the very last long paragraph on what page is it?
It is slightly, there's slightly some fear kind of stuff in this article.
Well, it starts with the reckless rush and scramble for wealth, the disproportionate passion for publicity, and the frittering externality and sensual dissipation which rule alike in the fashionable and in the industrial life of the nation exert a vulgarizing power which goes far to neutralize the unparalleled opportunities and the inspiring liberty enjoyed by our people.
Yeah,
there's more, obviously.
Right.
But that to me is kind of like, beware of this.
Our pursuit of rich and fame is far. Our desire to pursue fame and wealth is far greater than our desire to pursue goodness, and
because it's hard.
Yeah. It's simple. It's just not easy.
Yeah.
And don't
simple and not easy. That's a really good.
Yes, it's the simple but not easy doctrine. As we wrap up our discussion here on the article, The Study of Character in America by William Rounsville Alger, 33rd degree. Final thoughts, Brother Chris Ruli.
Final thoughts. This is an interesting article. I think you should check it out. And Brother Bowers did a great job recording it. Check it out. See what you think in terms of how it can be applied. I personally think that if you swapped out a couple words with more, updated verbiage from today.
You mean simpler?
Well, updated verbiage from today. I think, replace prize fighter with social media influencer and all that stuff. I think you'll find
emojis.
I'm waiting for the full emoji article. Someone writes an article in all emojis.
It's coming.
Oh, no.
It's coming, thanks to AI. So, Brother Matt Bowers, final thoughts on the study of character in America.
I thoroughly enjoyed this article, and it smacked me in the face with its relevance. I mean, back then to now, in the future, there's not enough of this out there. There's the easy path that most people seem to take, and not the simple one, but the simple path is hard.
I agree. I enjoy the article, although I do, as I said at the beginning, I was being a little glib the way I put it. Then I grow weary of this, the way things used to be type of attitude. And I do think that there is that idea that it's simple, but it's not easy in terms of gathering knowledge and improving yourself as a person. But I think one of the things that the article fails at is recognizing what is involved in those other pursuits. As for instance, it sure seems easy to be a boxer. You get in the ring and you beat up the other guy before he beats you up. But the hours and hours and hours of training that goes into that, and the amount of study that goes into that, and of the sweet science, and that can easily apply to social media influencers. It looks just like they're taking pictures of themselves in their underwear, but they're doing it in a very calculated way to game the algorithms and to game the system to get the most eyeballs. And so there's some real thought and work that goes into that I think this discounts with whole cloth. And so I think this is a great article for conversation, though some of the opinions in here I would take umbrage with. And I'll see his 50-cent words and raise him umbrage. So
Ooh,
there you
look
go.
at that.
Well, thank you guys very much. This has been a great discussion. If you're listening and you have some thoughts on this, you think we got it right, you think we got it wrong, please, podcast@scottishrite.org is the email address. And if you're watching this on our YouTube channel or listening on YouTube, you can leave your comments below. We will read them all and maybe bring them up on our next episode. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us for our first New Age Masonic podcast. Brother Chris, your thoughts overall? I think we did all right.
I think we did all right.
I was
We hit
entertained.
politics. We hit the contemporary issues. We talked about Putin. So I mean, we're really just
what else is there?
Jeez,
What
I mean,
else is
we're
there?
really doing something. Yeah.
Brother Matt Bowers.
To quote Adam Sandler, not too shabby.
That's all right. Well, thank you guys again. The New Age Masonic Podcast is brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction. That's Chris Ruli, 32nd degree KCCH. Matt Bowers, 18th degree. I'm Maynard Edwards, 32nd degree KCCH. We'll see you next time.